Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you to IWEA for giving me the opportunity to speak and present the results of this study that we've done with them, and thank you for listening. So, my name is Blanckley, and I'm going to talk to you about the value that renewables can bring to Irish homes and businesses. So before I go into the details of the study, I just want to sort of put up a few little factoids just to kind of set the scene. So 33%. That was renewables penetration in 2018. 70%, we all know that one. That's the target for 2030, so as you can tell, pretty ambitious. Net zero is the UK government target, which is now, well, legally binding, such as that is, and Ireland obviously has a similar ambition to get to. So this isn't just about 2030, there is a longer-term story. 15%. As we've heard just now, it's the corporate PPA target, which again, quite challenging. And lastly, 50 euros a megawatt hour, that's the approximate price of the most recent clearing bids in the GB-CFD auction. So again, a lot to think about. So coming on to the study itself and what benefits renewables could bring. So first of all, lower wholesale prices. The chart you can see in front of you has a supply curve in blue, demand in orange, and where the two intersect is roughly what's going to happen in terms of setting the price. So when you don't have much wind and solar, on a peak day, you could have OCGT setting the price, and it's going to be quite expensive. If you build a whole load of wind and solar, you effectively shift the supply curve to the right, and prices settle at a lower level. Now, the benefit that can bring looks to be really quite considerable. However, that's not the only side of the story. Obviously, there's potentially costs to supporting renewables. In this context, obviously, Ireland has the Renewable Electricity Scheme, which, as Eamon said, is a two-way CFD. And in practice, what that structure means is there will be periods where renewables are receiving support, and there will also be periods when renewables are paying back, right? Now, clearly, then the level of the strike price is going to play a big role in what the net cost of that support is going to be. But that's not the only cost. There are others, including grid reinforcement, constraint payments, ancillary services. If rock-off limits have to change, maybe plants have to be upgraded. It's unclear what might happen to total capacity payments. What I would say is that if you've got a view on electricity prices and strike prices, the support for renewables and how much that might cost is quite easy. Well, conceptually at least. The rest of it is genuinely quite hard to know. At this point in time, I'm not sure there is a particular consensus on how you go about running the grid at levels of system non-synchronous penetration of 90, 95. And without really knowing what sort of the technology list is that's going to provide that, it's kind of hard to come up with the costs. So for the purposes of this study, we're just going to ignore them. So what have we done? Well, we've basically split the issue into two parts. One is a wholesale price saving. And on this, we've looked at what wholesale prices might look like if renewables capacity didn't change after 2020. So we've assumed that the 40% target gets met, and then renewables capacity stays the same. Then we have another scenario which effectively builds a lot of extra renewables capacity, which takes us to renewables penetration of 70% by 2030. Now, one thing to mention is that we've done this on an all-island basis, and we've ignored differences between corporate PPAs, RES. We've basically just said it's all done under CFDs. So just bear that in mind. Fuel prices, carbon prices, everything else, same between these two. So really the only difference is renewables, and that lets us work out how much you save on wholesale prices. Then the second part is what we call the stabilization cost, and this is effectively how much it's going to cost on a net basis to support the renewables that get built after 2020. So you sum up all of the periods where renewables are receiving support, you net that off against all the periods where they're paying support, and that's essentially your cost. So if you run that annually and look forwards from 2025 to 2040, this is the picture you see. And this is with assuming strike prices are at 60 euros a megawatt hour forever. So the main point that I want you to take home from this is that the savings from lower wholesale prices significantly outweigh the cost of support. And this is true even at strike prices of 65, at strike prices of 50. It's just a very, very big impact. If you sum that up over the whole period for 15 years, these are the net figures that we were coming up with. So stabilization costs in total are about 3.2 billion euro in present value terms, but wholesale price savings are nudging 5.8 billion euro. So on a net basis, you're looking at consumer savings of about 2.6 billion euro. Now, I don't want you to get too hung up on those figures because, as I've said, that's not all of the cost involved. So this isn't the actual bottom line. But what you can think of is that figure of 2.6 billion euro being the budget for all of the other stuff that has to get done. So that's the budget for reinforcing the grid. It could be the budget for extra ancillary services payments, for paying for constraints, that sort of thing. So now you might be thinking, strike prices aren't going to be 60. Well, if they're a little bit higher, you will still receive quite significant benefits. On the left-hand side, we've got strike prices at 50 euros a megawatt hour, and this is why I showed you the GB offshore wind price, because if Ireland managed that over 15 years, benefits could be 4 billion euro. If strike prices end up at about the level of European onshore wind in 2018, you're still looking at 1.9, 2.5 billion euro. And I think even under these circumstances, that's quite a lot of budget for the sort of costs that need to be incurred. And certainly my personal view is I'm hopeful that that means 70% is a break-even kind of position at worst. Now, I want to move on to the implications for corporates, because so far we've essentially ignored the difference between what a corporate might think and what a consumer might think. And the issue with that is that if you build a whole load of renewables and wholesale prices fall, corporates can benefit from that without having to get directly involved, right? So given the renewables target is 70%, in 2020 the target is 40, you've got to gain an extra 30. Half of that has to come from corporate PPAs. So if you go back a couple of slides and you look at my stabilization costs and halve them, that's effectively the cost that is being put on corporate Ireland to fund renewables over the next 15, 20 years. Now, again, don't get too hung up on the numbers. This is an all-Ireland study. It's not just about the Republic of Ireland. Obviously, the policy situation in Northern Ireland is considerably different. But all the same, it's hundreds of millions, billions of support that at the moment you might think has to come from the corporate sector. But here's the thing. If you build those renewables and corporates pay for it, everybody benefits, right? And I would say that gives quite a lot of rationale for the development of incentives that will help the corporate sector get involved in renewables in Ireland. So, I'm going to close up with a few thoughts and just summarize the messages I've just given you. So first of all, if you build a load of extra wind and solar in Ireland, wholesale prices are likely to fall by a very significant amount. And this is compared to the thermal non-renewable alternative. On the flip side of that, the cost of supporting all those renewables isn't that large and certainly doesn't outweigh the benefits that those lower wholesale prices bring. Now, it's very hard for us to see that day to day because all we see is the actual price. But if you could construct a world where you had kind of your counterfactual, you can see a very big difference. The third thing I want to mention is simply that these what we've called quote-unquote consumer value estimates miss out a whole bunch of costs. But that doesn't mean they're useless, because what you can do is think of these as a budget. Now, if you look over the next 15, 20 years, to me, that budget looks quite large. It might be if you're sat at Airgrid, you think the budget's really quite small. I don't know. but it's at least something there to play with. Lastly, corporates can benefit from lower prices without having to get involved, right? And I think as you build more and more renewables and as wholesale prices fall even further, there's less, in some ways there is less incentive for corporates to get involved with renewables directly. And as a result of that, I think policymakers need to consider quite carefully, and as far as I know they are, how to incentivize corporates to basically get involved in the sector and take on some of the burden. The numbers we've put up here effectively are completely ambivalent to whether it's the government or corporates that provide the support. So in many ways, the budgets that we've provided are net of any transfers that might have to, or incentives that might have to go to corporates. But at the same time, I think it's fairly clear that some form of incentives will be needed. And we look forward to seeing what those might be when SEAI comes out with their report. And that's it from me. Thank you.